What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to Physical Education with Coach. I am Coach CC. Today, we're going to visit a topic that is very near and dear to my heart, but I promise you I will not let my opinions get in the way because today we're going to start emphasizing the question, does physical education facilitate academic success? All right. There's going to be many sections in this series because the evidence goes on forever. Right? We can look at studies all the way back to ancient Asian cultures, ancient Greek and Roman cultures. We can look at some very successful sport populations, such as the Soviet Union, such as the Scandinavian populations, and outside of general populations, we have pretty successful athletic populations in this country as well. But that's not really what we're concerned with. What we're really concerned with is the state physical education programs that we're offering our general population effective in helping those students not just physically but mentally, psychologically? Are we influencing these kids to achieve better scores in the classroom and be successful later in life? If not, what do we need to be doing? Right? Hopefully you've seen my previous series on here where I addressed the data from my individual PE classes. And to be truthful, actually, to have the utmost integrity and have a clear foundation of how to answer this question, I think you have to have three distinct aspects. You have to have data that you collected and crunched on your own to understand what's happening in your personal population. You have to have the expert opinion. Okay, what are the best physical education teachers, sport coaches, what are they doing? And what are they having success with? And the last piece is one that I think a lot of people frequently miss. And I think it's because there could be a negative stigma against research. We know that a lot of research is done in a lab, in a completely controlled environment, and it is not necessarily realistic in terms of application, but that's not always true. There can be a lot of takeaway messages from research, and in order to complete that tripod, and like I said, have a very good foundation in answering your questions, you have to consider what the research is telling us. Because once again, it does have a place in answering these questions. So here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to introduce to you how I break down articles. And we're going to walk through breaking down a very large article. It's called a systematic review. All right? So here's how I break down articles. I like to look at the title. I like to read up a little bit on the author. I like to understand the location that this paper was written because I think there are cultural implications for some of these papers. After that, I like to check out the citation, make sure I'm always placing a citation with what I am doing in my work, just so I'm not taking other people's work. I think most practitioners are not always out there creating these foundational theories. What they're doing is they're finding research, finding ways to apply it, and taking the best pieces of research and turning it into application, which is why I say it has such a profound place in our practice. After that, we're going to look at the rationale or the introduction to the paper, really. We'll look at the paper's true purpose and hypothesis, which is established from the rationale. Then we'll summarize a lot of the results. With this particular paper, summarizing the results for us is going to be going through the individual papers because I think that's very important, and a lot of times systematic reviews water down each individual paper just for the greater result of the majority of the studies. We're not going to do that. We're going to visit all these papers because there's only 9 of them. So you can question whether this is a real systematic review if you want or not. But methodological discussion is a different topic, and we can have that on another day. Then we'll look at, how do we apply this? What is the implication from this information? So let's start off with some of our basic questions, right? The author, his name is Eero Haapala. He's located in Finland. He is a researcher at a university. The rationale for this was that there's a lot of evidence that shows that there are benefits for physical activity, particularly in physical and psychological or cognitive health. We see reducing the chances of chronic illnesses, particularly in children. We see increased cognition in older adults. And that's very positive with older adults because this had a positive effect on brain health and brain function, which could lead to preventing some of the structural causes of dementia, which could prevent things like Alzheimer's disease, right? We have improved cognition and academic measures in children, which we all know is kind of the basis of this video. What are we looking at it for? We want to know the rationale for why we're looking at it is because we don't just want to improve kids' fitness levels. We want them to get better academically as well. Improved acute or short-term neuroelectrical processes in adults and children. If we don't know, the nervous system is driven electrically, so if we can make those processes more efficient, there is a chance to have this secondary carryover to cognitive functioning as well. And let's look at some of the broader implications, right? Those were some of the more mechanistic implications of this, but what's some of the broader rationale? So we know that children in the Western world are not meeting physical activity recommendations, and that doesn't just mean the Western Hemisphere. That means the Western world is places like Europe, it's places like America and Canada, places like Scandinavia, places that are a little more advanced in terms of technology, education, economics, right? What we're seeing is an improvement in a lot of areas in life, but we're seeing this decline in physical activity, and that's what this introduction really speaks to, right? Obesity in children is more prevalent. We see the need for intervention increasing. We see that physical activity is increasing the amount. Physical activity, is reducing the amount of adiposity. We know that physical activity can prevent weight gain, particularly unhealthy weight gain. We've started to see some papers come out on the effects of obesity, childhood obesity, being associated with poor academic performance, poor cognition. And then we've also seen some studies that take the next step, and we've seen that process reversed, right? We've seen children who had poor cognitive skills improve their cognitive skills with exercise as an intervention. So we kind of know that we have, not necessarily, I don't want to say a holy grail, but we have this positive effect that we can be taking on our students in schools using these state-mandated physical education programs. And that's what a lot of this is geared towards. What are those programs? What are going to be those interventions that are going to be important for improving fitness and academics? Well, we do have some evidence for physical activity supporting cognitive development and academic performance in children, just not a lot of evidence. Okay, and there hasn't necessarily been the type of evidence, in other words, investigative studies, or a lot of investigative studies, let's say, that have specifically proved that cardiometabolic interventions are improving cognition in academics. Okay, and when we speak about cardiometabolic health or cardiometabolic interventions, those are actually pretty basic interventions, and you'll see that as we go through some of the literature here. We're talking about running, we're talking about walking, we're talking about different modalities of what we would typically term cardiovascular exercise or aerobic exercise. And then, playing with the intensity a little bit, playing with the volume a little bit, the rest variables, and seeing what happens with cognitive and academic performance when we play around with those variables. All right, so that led the author of this paper, Eero, to say that the purpose of their paper was to give a nice broad overview of the evidence of the effects of physical activity, these interventions, and how they played a role in affecting cognitive abilities. And when they're talking about cognitive abilities, they're talking about things like concentration, kids concentrating in the classroom for longer periods of time, recall memory, being more attentive in the learning process, okay? And then they're also looking at the effects on academic achievements. And when we're talking academic achievements, we're not just talking GPAs in here. We're talking academic achievements that truly affect individual outcomes as well as district outcomes. I know that not a lot of people are physical education teachers. I understand that. But one of the things that we can see with improvements in standardized tests is increased funding, right? If you can show that you are having a major impact on the students within that district, that can impact the amount of funding that that district gets and a decrease in oversight from the state and the federal government, which is always a positive thing. So we're going to see some effects of exercise on arithmetic, mathematics skills, language skills, reading skills, and then there's a couple different papers in here that attacked the effects on standardized scores. And most importantly, I want to point out that the people in this study were children and adolescent ages. Okay, and I went a little bit further to show you the actual age of these students. So down here you see we had a total of 9 studies, and that brought in over 2,000 subjects. Okay, and it was mixed, male and female, in a lot of these studies. If you want to go read the actual paper and see the subsequent papers that were put into this paper, or I guess the previous papers that were put into this paper, you can look at the reference section. I threw it in there at the end. Every kid was between the age of 7 and 16. I've seen this so many times where people are referencing ways to be most effective in the classroom, and the research they're using is referring to older adults and maybe young adults, which is still 18 plus, which might still be a little bit too old to take and prescribe to students. And I say that sparingly because I don't want people to come back and attack me and say just because an adult runs a certain mile time doesn't mean we can't apply that same setting to a younger student with an advanced training need. All right? I know it's possible, but it's not probable in this age group. And so that's the most important thing that I want to point out here, is that every kid involved in this information that I'm about to share with you was between the age of 7 and 16. There were no adults in these studies. All right. So let's take a look at the first grouping of studies. The first grouping of studies was about 5 studies. Okay, the people that gathered the information for this review were looking for a high amount of control in terms of a methods or methodological standard, meaning there were about 100 papers that they looked at, but a lot of them were excluded because the methods were not clean enough, I guess you could say. That being said, there are still a lot of methodological issues that I found in these individual papers because I did go and read them because I'm a nerd like that. But again, like I said, that's for another day. We're just going to look at what some of the greater implications from each of these papers are. So the first study was by a guy named Bud et al., and he was out of Germany. And what you had was 2 different groups. And this is what made a lot of this information indiscernible, I will say, by the naked eye. A lot of people looked at this study and said, well, PE may not have an effect on academic performance. And that is completely wrong. Because I want to tell you, my main argument for that is the majority of the control groups in these studies are traditional curricular PE groups, which means traditional curricular PE is spending 3 to 6 week blocks focusing on different sports. So you might start out with American football for the first 3 to 6 weeks, then move to volleyball, and then after that move to soccer. And by that time, you're getting close to finals week, so you're preparing kids for testing and getting them out. And then the next semester, you might focus on, let's say tennis, and then a basketball, and then baseball. And then again, you're working towards getting your kids prepared for physical fitness testing at the end of the year. So it's very basic. This first study, they just looked at changing up the style of curriculum. So you had a 10-minute sport curriculum, right, or a sport lesson, compared with another group who did 10 minutes of physical exercise, right? The focus was just on fitness, and they did things like balance exercise, reaction exercises, things that required adjustment and differentiation skills. Okay, so it was very different than just learning traditional sports skills. And at the end of this intervention, it was a short intervention, and in these first 5 studies you're going to see it was very much like let's do one session, let's test them before, let's do the intervention, and then let's test them after. They were just concerned about acute effects, right? Short-term effects. So you had one group do a 10-minute workout, one group do a 10-minute sport lesson. And at the end, they did a specific standardized test looking at cognition. And what they saw was the exercise intervention group, right, not the sport group, had greater improvements in concentration, greater improvements in standardized test scores, which I spelled wrong and I will correct right now. And also, they decreased the amount of mistakes that they had on their assessment. Right? So instantly off the bat, this first study, we're seeing that maybe the implication is that PE needs to change a little bit. Okay, I'm just going to throw that in there. Next study comes from Ellenberg out of Canada. And the reason why I look at these locations is because I think there are distinct cultural differences. And so one of the greatest parts of this paper is that it pulled studies from all around the world. Even though there's only 9 studies, a lot of them come from different locations. The majority of them come from America, which makes it most relevant to us. So that's another reason why I like using this study in giving evidence for my lesson plans. But you're going to see that a lot of these studies coming from different places definitely help give validity to this information. So let's get back to it. Ellenberg out of Canada. What they had there was a true intervention study with a true control group. Okay, and the control group basically sat and watched TV for 30 minutes. The intervention group did 30 minutes of cycling at 130 beats per minute, which if you're looking at kids, that's like a moderate intensity, right? Kids are pretty healthy cardiovascular systems and the ability to get their heart rates up very high. So 130 beats per minute should not be challenging for an average student. For an obese or overweight student, it might be a different story. So again, acute intervention. And what we saw was that their ability to choose correct responses and their ability to answer questions quickly, right? So reaction time, those things improved significantly in the intervention group and did not improve in the control group. Then we have a study from McNaughton et al. Out of USA. We had 4 groups in this one. It's a little bit more complex. It made it a little bit more messy of a study. You had a 20-minute walking group, a 30-minute walking group, a 40-minute walking group, and then a group that did no exercise. So again, we have a traditional intervention study with a traditional control group here. And then there were also different groups at different times, right? So they looked at a time effect at 8:30 in the morning, 11:50 in the, let's say, midday afternoon, and then 2:20 p.m. What we saw, the biggest takeaway was all of the exercise groups improved. None of them significant from the other for the majority of the times, but there were specific areas where we did see some significant improvements one over the other. We saw a significant improvement in mathematical computation, so they took a little math test basically, and then significant improvements in concentration as well after the 30 to 40 minute walking groups, specifically at the times of 11:50 and 2:20. Now, I'm usually an advocate for morning PE, but what this is saying is that, it's a couple of things. That 30 to 40 minute time period for what PE is recommended by state standards, it is valid. Another thing, maybe PE is better off midday and towards the end of the day for academics. Who knows? It's just one paper, right? But it can have a little bit of implications and application for what we do. Now we come back to Budd et al. He did another study out of Germany where he had 3 different groups. Again, traditional intervention, traditional control group with no exercise, people that just sat still and did nothing on the day of the intervention. And then the other 2 groups, you had a moderate intensity, which was a 12-minute run. We typically call that a Cooper's test. So they took heart rates prior to, took them during, took them after. And then you had a high-intensity 12-minute run. So 70 to 85%. I don't know if I mentioned it. The moderate intensity was 50 to 60%. What we saw at the end of that short-term intervention was the moderate intensity group improved their working memory significantly compared to the other conditions. But also, the most important part of this study was that we saw that adolescents with low working memory scores at baseline, regardless of the group they were in, intervention group that is, not the no exercise group, regardless of the group they were in, moderate or high intensity, they improved their results. So this kind of tells us that low-performing students may have greater implications from the implementation of exercise routines than higher-performing students. Again, what I'm adding on to these is pure speculation. It's discussion, okay? I'm going to tell you what each study says, and then I'm going to tell you where I think it applies. So the last study in this first group of single bout exercise effect on cognition studies was from Zervas et al. And this is a study out of Greece, if you couldn't tell by the name already. This one was really interesting, and I think it adds a lot of it just adds a lot of substance to this review because it was different in the fact that it used endurance-trained students, untrained students, and then it also had a control group that did no exercise. So I think it was really neat. It added another brick in the wall to these 9 studies to give us a holistic picture of the effects of physical activity. So both of the endurance-trained and the untrained group, they did strenuous treadmill exercise. Wasn't really a protocol for it. Unfortunately, I don't have the information based on that. But what we do know is they were able to identify an association between improvements in cognitive skills and improvements in performance measures. So they measured VO2 max through like a pacer test, basically. So it's an indirect measurement. And if you don't know what a pacer test is, you basically have 2 cones and you run back and forth to the sound of a beep. It's like the yo-yo intermittent beep test as well. And they were able to show an improvement in VO2 max. And also, they were able to show that both exercise groups were able to improve their decision time, so speedier decisions, but more so, they were receiving more correct answers on the post-test than they had on the previous test. And then this was also through this cognitive assessment they gave them, they were also able to show an improvement in attention, alertness, and concentration. So that was the short-term studies. Let's look at some of the chronic studies. There's 4 of these. The majority of them are out of USA. So like I said, a lot of these indicating the geographic region has cultural implications, I believe. So a lot of these long-term studies are more pertinent to North Americans. I think the majority of them are done here. So keep that in mind. It might be a lot different elsewhere. This first study, again, really good brick in the wall because it was the only one that used obese children. And we identified in the beginning that that was one of the big issues, right? That we have obese children, and we know there might be some kind of association between obesity and poor performance, poor academic performance, that is. Now, all these studies were, I don't know if you'd call them longitudinal studies, but they were longer than one session. Let's put it that way. This first study here by Davis was 18 weeks long, and he had 3 groups. Again, traditional intervention. There is a control, no exercise group, and then there was a high-dose exercise group, which was 40 minutes a day, and a low-dose exercise group, which was 20 minutes a day. And what we saw after the intervention, the 18-week intervention, was that both exercise groups improved significantly when it came to planning tasks. And they stated that these planning tasks were requiring executive function. So they kind of alluded to improved brain function through this exercise intervention. And then one of the other ways that they were able to demonstrate some evidence for that was that specifically the high dose group, right, the 40 minutes a day, which if you guys remember, that's the recommendation for physical education, especially at the high school level. They were able to show an enhancement or an improvement in their mathematics scores, their arithmetic test scores. So that's a big implication right there. I think that shows that we need to either keep that 40-minute a day period, or we possibly need to elevate it. And when I say that, you'll see why in the next couple studies. So the next study was from Salas et al. Out of USA. This was a study that was twice as long, 36 weeks. And again, they did a great job finding different populations within the child and adolescent population in this review. I don't know how many times I can point that out. So this study was probably the best one in the entire review, right? You had, not only was it 36 weeks long, but you had 2 different cohorts, and it was over the course of 2 years. That's amazing, right? That you can hold on to a study this long and not try to publish results preemptively. This is good that they waited. So what they had was 3 different groups. Again, great job with the design. They had a traditional intervention with a control group that did no exercise. Remember, these were 2 different cohorts, so they weren't, negatively impacting these kids by not making them do exercise for over 2 years. It was 2 different groups of children for each of the cohorts. Within the cohorts, they had 2 exercise-based groups. One was with an exercise specialist, okay, so maybe an exercise physiologist or a fitness trainer, somebody who specializes not in education or physical education, but somebody who specializes in just exercise, we'll say. And then you had an exercise group that was with their classroom teacher. Okay, there were a lot of conclusions in this paper, but I tried to pull out, I think, what the most significant ones were. And the ones that I found to be most interesting was that the exercise intervention groups, regardless of who taught them, had higher scores in language and reading. So we could see, implementing exercise could improve our English learning skills. And then the second one was that there was a significant association with the exercise specialist group and their reading scores, right? So I don't know what the tie is there. Again, it's just an association. It's not a cause and effect, but that's just really interesting. The other one I didn't write in here, but I found really interesting about this paper was there was a time period in the second cohort where I don't know if the teachers were just being very strenuous with their assignments, but everybody's marks, regardless of their group, decreased. But what they were able to show was that the 2 exercise groups decreased the least amount in their academic scores over that time of stress. We know that exercise can be used as a stress reliever, and maybe possibly that's one of the things during the most strenuous periods, let's say, finals week or graduation week. Maybe those are the times where we really need to be looking at using exercise as an intervention in our high schools or in our middle schools or whenever our students are experiencing stress. Then we have a paper by Ahmad et al. This paper comes out of Canada. Again, not a lot of information in this paper. I really question how this paper even got published, because when they were setting up their 2 different groups, they were not aligned very well. One of the things that you'll notice about this paper, if you were to go back and read it on your own, is the overarching theme is that there was no effect between the groups. But when you look at the numbers, which you always have to do when you read papers, you always have to look at the numbers and just maybe think, maybe they could have missed something. The baseline scores for the exercise group in this study by Ahmad et al. Were significantly lower than the baseline scores for the control group. Okay, I want you to keep that in mind for a second. So there were 2 groups. The control group was just doing curricular PE, which is 40 minutes a day, 40 minutes for 2 days per week. Okay, and remember, when we talk about curricular PE, we're talking about going out and learning how to play sports and then just participating in team and dual sports. Then you had the control or the intervention group, which was doing curricular PE on top of classroom physical activity. And their classroom physical activity just consisted of traditional exercises, traditional workouts, right? These low intensity walking, running, calisthenics for 15 minutes, and that was 5 days a week. Now they did this for 16 months. That's almost a 1.5 year time period of this intervention. That's one of the things I do praise about this study, having the patience to go through a long-term intervention like this. And like I mentioned, the overarching result of this study is that there was no difference because they measured their differences based on their their national standardized test, which is the CAT, the Canadian Achievement Test. And like I mentioned, the scores were significantly different when it came to the baseline scores. Now, you take away just looking at significance, you could see that the intervention group did have greater achievements on the CAT test, and that's particularly because they had a larger percentage increase from baseline to final score. And the other thing is they didn't evaluate that difference, the percentage change between the two groups. They just looked at the end score and noted that they were not significantly different. But when you don't equal out those baseline scores, there is going to be a significant change, even though it might look like a small change. That's one of the things we look for in education. And that's also one of the aspects we look for in sport, too. We're not looking for massive changes in performance. We're looking at incremental, small changes over time that will result in student success and lifelong learning. This last study looking at physical training, long-term training, was done by Dwyer et al. In Australia. And I did very poorly with my spelling. I apologize, guys. This was a 14-week intervention, and our control group was, again, curricular PE. So in Australia, where they did this study, that meant 30 minutes, 3 days per week. And again, remember, that is sport training. And then the two intervention groups, they did fitness training, which is what they considered a focus on heart rate and intensity. So it was mostly running. And then a skill group, which was mostly focusing on learning sports skills. So and that included some of the other basic skills too: running, jumping, throwing. I'm trying to think: bowling, catching. There's different styles of throwing, but there's a whole list of them. I don't remember them off the top of my head, so I'm sorry. I'll have to pull that up in another video sometime. But the biggest takeaway from this study, there were similar results in the end. Again, this is another study that I think it's difficult to look at because the control group was not a true doing nothing control group. It was a curricular PE group. You saw improvements in both groups, physical and mental improvements in both groups. But one of the biggest notes was that in the fitness intervention group, we saw better classroom behavior. Apparently, they were measuring that in this study. That becomes important, I think, with just about every group of student. Classroom behavior is deteriorating on a daily basis. That's why we switch different intervention styles, behavioral intervention styles, every year, right? We're looking for the best method to get kids not only to sit still and behave socially, but enjoy the learning process without feeling like they have to act out. So if exercise is that way, maybe we need to increase the amount of exercise. And that's what I had mentioned earlier. Maybe 40 minutes isn't enough. Maybe it does need to be 75 minutes a day. Who knows? So let's look at what the implications were based on this author's thoughts. So I think this was pretty notable, what he first indicates. Single exercise bouts are going to enhance cognition and academics in children and adolescents. Pretty much every single one of the studies that we looked at in there were 4 or 5 of them, they showed improvements in the exercise group. And that showed that they could improve concentration and memory. I thought that was also a big takeaway. The other thing is that he noted that major improvements in cognitive function and academics may need longer interventions and lifelong physical training. Now, I agree with that, but I also disagree. I think it absolutely does. Because what we saw, like I mentioned, were control groups that were just curricular PE groups. And when your control group is just a curricular PE group and both groups are showing improvement, you are showing that we have improvements in academics with PE across the board. What we're arguing is different methods in PE. Which method is the best? And if fitness is going to show more improvements than sports and games, maybe we got to change up the curriculum a little bit to move towards fitness. And there's quite a few states that have already done this in this country. California is not one of them, which doesn't shock me. But that's what the thinking needs to be, right? Not, well, PE's not working, so maybe we should cut it out. No, PE is working. PE is working tremendously if it can show that with completely different styles of training, we can improve academic performance. That's great to know for students because not all students learn the same way. And that's the other huge takeaway that this study doesn't note is if we're showing academic achievement in improvements in kids who are just playing sports and games, and we're showing academic achievement in kids who are just doing 10 minutes of skill training, kids doing 40 minutes of walking, kids doing 12 minutes of treadmill training, kids doing 75 minutes of sport or fitness training. Wow, we just identified several modalities for how PE can have a positive effect on our students, cognitively and academically. That just tells me that I have more tools to throw into the tool bag. And whenever I get a kid that doesn't want to do my workout for the day, I can always pick something else out of the tool bag and say, hey, what do you think about this? And that's that much more probability for that kid to succeed. Thank you guys for visiting us for our first session of answering the question, which is, does physical education facilitate academic success? This is the Physical Education with Coach Network, and I am your coach, Coach Cullen Carroll. As always, have a wonderful day.